So this idea of human origins just bears very heavily on our whole Christian outlook. And if we sacrifice the idea of man's unique creation and of Adam and Eve, of a single pair, Adam and Eve, and of their fall and their sin, we have pretty much gutted Christianity. But to argue that we come from a common descent commits a logical fallacy. So the argument goes like this: if common descent, then similarity. Similarity. We have similarity, therefore common descent. So you can see it's structured in the form of a logical fallacy. All right? There may be something else that produces similarity other than common descent. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Okay, so we are, as I said, we are on our fourth lesson on origins in our science module. We have one more lesson on science next week, but this will wrap up our lessons on origins. And what I hope you've been seeing over the last few weeks is that the world, particularly naturalists, they give us one narrative of how things happened, how things came to be, how the cosmos came to be, how life came to be, and then last week we talked about the origin of the species. And they give us one narrative, and the Bible gives us really a very different narrative. And what the world wants us to believe, what they tell us, what they tell our children in school, what they tell us at the university, what they tell us through the media, is that we are compelled to believe the naturalist narrative because it's scientifically supported. It's the science, right? But I hope what you've been seeing is that naturalist narrative cannot be sustained. Okay, there is no real substantial scientific support for that narrative, and we have great, strong, legitimate reasons to believe the Christian view of origins. Okay, and really, perhaps maybe the most important question about origins that we face is the one we're going to talk about today, which is how did we as humans arrive? You know, what's the origin of humans? And if we have time, I want to also talk a little bit just about the whole idea of intelligent design. What exactly is it, and how do we use it? How can we use it as Christians? So we'll do that if we have time to do it. Last week I gave you a pretty substantial list of resources, and I think all of these were on that list last week, but they are particularly helpful in what we're talking about this week. So in that critique of theistic evolution, there's a fairly substantial section of about 200 pages or so that deals with the question of universal common descent and the origin of humans, the uniqueness of the human race, and that sort of thing. So there's a substantial section in that book, and fairly sophisticated. Then Ann Gager, Doug Axe, and Casey Luskin have written this book, Science and Human Origins, which actually covers a lot of the same ground that's in theistic evolution. Then Jonathan Wells' book, Icons of Evolution, Science or Myth, is a very readable book, and also deals with this question that we're going to talk about today. So as I said, when it comes to the question of origins, and particularly when it comes to the question of human origins, we really have kind of two narratives. We have two different stories, all right? And of course, the story that we get in, like I say, in the media, we get it in our schools, we get it in our culture, is the idea that humans were descended from the great apes some millions of years ago, 2 to 6 million years ago, or whatever. Okay, and Anne Gager, in her contribution to the Critique of Theistic Evolution, says, defines it this way or explains it this way. She says, more specifically, concerning human origins, the neo-Darwinian view is that we have a purely natural origin, fully explicable by unguided natural selection and acting on random variation. According to this view, the fossil record shows that we evolved from an ape-like ancestor, we share common ancestry with chimps, and we evolved from a population of several thousand at a minimum. Okay? So that's the first narrative. And of course, the alternative narrative, and the narrative that, of course, as Christians we defend, is that the human race descended from two individuals who were uniquely and specifically created by a divine act. And of course, Genesis represents that to us. In Genesis 1, he says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." And then over in chapter 2 of Genesis, he says, "Then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." I can't imagine two entirely different ways of looking at origins, and particularly the origins of humans. And it turns out, like I said, this may be the most important question of origins that we face, and the greatest challenge, because the biblical view of humans, of course, is that, as we just read, that we are created in the Imago Dei. So the question is, when we think about this question of origins, are we made by a specific, unique act of God? Did he create two specific individuals at the beginning and infuse those individuals with the Imago Dei, with the image of God? Okay? And if so, then human beings possess some kind of immeasurable, incalculable worth because we are made in God's image. Or, on the other hand, are we, as the evolutionists would say, are we just merely the product of chance mutations and natural selection? And if that's true, then we really are no greater significance than the chimpanzees or fungi. Okay, our significance is just simply how we happen to evolve. So this question of the Imago Dei is probably one of the most important questions when it comes to the whole question of ethics and morality and human value, social structure, social ethics, those kinds of things are incredibly important when it comes to this, are tremendously influenced by this question of the Imago Dei. And so if we sacrifice the Imago Dei, if we sacrifice this view of human origins, then we lose that significance that Scripture implies that we have. The other area where the idea of human origins is particularly important to us is in the area of sin and salvation. So, was there an original Adam and Eve? And did they sin as the Scripture tells us that they sinned? Did they introduce into the human race an inherited sin nature? And if they didn't, then what are we to make of the atoning work of Christ? Then the whole idea of the atonement, of Christ's coming, his incarnation, his dying for our sins, all becomes just some kind of strange morality myth of some kind. It really doesn't have any real significance or real bearing. So this idea of human origins just bears very heavily on our whole Christian outlook. And if we sacrifice the idea of man's unique creation and of Adam and Eve, of a single pair, Adam and Eve, and of their fall and their sin, we have pretty much gutted Christianity. We have nothing left to defend. So these questions are of just tremendous importance. So when we talk about the naturalist view, the evolutionist view of the origin of man, there are several things, of course, that they assert or they claim. And one is, of course, that Homo sapiens are descended through an evolutionary process. Typically, they're talking about neo-Darwinism, like we talked about last week. That we as human beings are descended through a neo-Darwinian process from the great apes. That our last common ancestors were the chimpanzees, or perhaps some intermediate, what we might call proto-humans, somewhere between the chimpanzees and the human race. And that the human race as we have it today, the human species, did not arise from a single couple, okay, one man and woman, but rather arose from a population of several thousand, possibly as many as 10,000. So evolutionists aren't in complete agreement on the number, but they are pretty much in agreement that the human race did not arise from one couple, but rather arose from several thousand, a population of several thousand of the first humans. Okay, this is really particularly significant idea in evolutionary thought, because what it implies then is that ultimately different groups of people in different parts of the world actually arose through a different process of evolution. And you can imagine where that can lead, okay, as far as racism and social aspects, the way we structure society and that sort of thing. If we have time, we may come back to that question. So what is the basis, what is the evidence that the evolutionist, that the naturalist offers for this particular view of origin? And there are four primary categories of evidence that they offer. And the first one is, the argument is that we now have, of course Darwin didn't have this when he first wrote, but we now have, according to this narrative, we now have such a thoroughly developed fossil record that it's just virtually a foregone conclusion that we went through this process. So the fossil record is supposedly so complete and so thorough that there's just no question but what we have moved through this process of evolution from chimpanzees to humans. The second aspect of evidence is the similarities between humans and chimpanzees. So I've got that big word morphological there, which just simply refers to the form or the structure of an organism. Okay, so in this case we're talking about humans and chimpanzees. And so they look at our form, they look at our structure, they look at our morphological aspects, and they see these, what they consider to be striking similarities between humans and chimpanzees, and their assumption there then is that that's an evidence that we come from a common ancestor. Okay, so there's this underlying assumption that similarity of form is evidence for evolution, is evidence for common ancestors. Keep that in mind. That's an underlying assumption, and we'll see the problem with that as we go forward here. Then, in addition to the morphological similarity, there's also a striking similarity in our genetic makeup. So oftentimes a figure of 1% difference is cited. So the argument is that the DNA, comparing the DNA of humans with the DNA of chimpanzees, there's only a 1% difference. So 99% of our DNA is the same. The argument being then, of course, well, obviously we're descended from the chimpanzees. We're so similar in our DNA. Again, notice there's an assumption going on there that similarity is evidence of descent. And then the fourth bit of evidence that's oftentimes brought, I mentioned this idea that we didn't evolve from a single pair, but we evolved from a number of different initial humans. And the reason that's argued is because within the human DNA across the world, there is a tremendous degree of diversity. And the argument is that given the amount of time that evolutionists say we have, 2 to 6 million years or whatever, depending on who you're talking to, given the amount of time that you have for the evolution of the human race after we broke off from the chimpanzees, there's not enough time to account for all of the diversity we have within the human DNA. So the only way to explain that is that the first humans that were actually, there were thousands of them. There wasn't just one couple. Okay. So those are the 4 lines of evidence that are typically offered in an argument for an evolutionary origin for humans. This just kind of may help you kind of think through how this is typically viewed, how the various great apes and chimpanzees and that sort of thing descended through this kind of commonly accepted tree of life sort of thing. So this gives you an idea of how it's typically viewed. But as it turns out, that whole narrative of evolution from chimpanzees to human is just wrought with a number of problems, okay? And particularly the evidences that I just listed there for you, there's tremendous challenges there. And so I've listed 7 of them in our lesson today. And the first one is when you think back about our lesson last week. So last week we talked about neo-Darwinism and the problems facing neo-Darwinism. And you remember we listed 10 separate distinct problems with neo-Darwinism. So we talked about things like irreducible complexity, the problem of information, where do you get new information, the problem of body plans, how do you come up with a body plan, the whole idea of how do you get this level of consciousness and cognition and values and that sort of thing, the problem of devolution, and we talked about a number of these problems. So before you ever begin to talk about humans evolving from chimpanzees, you have to answer all those questions we dealt with last week. So that's the first problem. The first problem, and we have more, but the first problem is all the 10 problems we had last week, okay? So that's problem number 1. Then again, you'll oftentimes get this whole thing about fossils. So the fossil record is a big thing for the evolutionists. But it turns out that the whole science related to the fossils, particularly from chimpanzees to human and the early hominin fossils, is just a tremendously fragmented. And it's fragmented in 3 ways. So the first thing is the fossil record itself is fragmented. Okay, so when we're talking about the fossil record, we're talking about that the whole collection of fossils from chimpanzees or whatever, all the way through so-called proto-humans and up into humans. Okay, and it turns out that whole record is tremendously fragmented. So what they like to do is they like to communicate the idea, they like to claim that we just have this very exhaustive, very complete picture through the fossil record. And that just simply isn't true. The actual fossil record is completely at odds with that claim that we have a complete picture in the fossil record. So, for example, this article from just a few years ago in National Geographic said there are long periods of time for which few or no hominin fossils exist. Fossils attributed to Homo in the period 2 to 3 million years ago are exceedingly rare. You could put them all into a small shoebox and still have room for a good pair of shoes. Okay, So this idea that we have this exhaustive supply of fossils is just simply not supported by the evidence. There are just actually not nearly as many as you might imagine. And then Casey Luskin, in his contribution to that critique on theistic evolution, says, according to Harvard zoologist Richard Lewontin, quote, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. And then Luskin goes on, he says, despite the claims of evolutionary paleoanthropologists and unceasing media hype, the fragmented hominin fossil record does not document the evolution of humans from ape-like precursors. Known hominins fall into two separate groups, ape-like and human-like, with a distinct gap between them. The genus Homo appears in an abrupt, non-Darwinian fashion without evidence of an evolutionary transition from ape-like hominins. So the point there, of course, that Casey Luskin is making is this whole idea that we have this very clear picture all the way through the process is just simply not true. What the fossils are, you've got fossils that are very clearly ape-like, and you've got fossils that are human-like, and you get no transition in between them. So the fossil record is very fragmented. But in addition to that, the fossil specimens themselves are fragmented, okay? So what we have with the fossil specimens is typically what we have in most cases is we just have little pieces, okay? So we'll have a collection of teeth in one case, or a jawbone, or a femur, or we'll just have various fragments of bones, okay? And so what that means is that if you're digging around and you find a group of teeth, and then you want to make some conclusions about what kind of a creature this came from, you're going to get into a lot of speculation, okay? And so this is very characteristic of this area of study. And then oftentimes what happens is you get these what we might call flesh reconstructions. So they'll take a jawbone that they find, or an arm, or a bunch of teeth, a handful of teeth or something, and they will construct in their minds a whole creature from that, whether it's a chimpanzee or a human or whatever it is, or a Neanderthal or whatever it is, okay? Well, clearly there's a lot of subjectivity there. There's a lot of guesstimating of exactly what. So oftentimes you'll read, for example, in some magazine, some science magazine, or in a newspaper, some great discovery, and they've discovered this, fossil remains of such and such. And what you'll see is a picture of the whole creature, the whole person, okay? And oftentimes you'll see them in some kind of environment. They're out hunting with a spear, or they're standing in front of a cave, in front of a fire, or something. You see a whole environment. You might see them working with tools. All of that is speculation. All of that is speculation based on a fragment of a fossil that's been discovered. And what typically is done then when these kind of imaginary creatures are kind of fleshed out, so to speak, from a specimen, is the tendency is to minimize the intellectual capacity of the human. So the image you get, the picture you get, the artist's rendering that you get tends to minimize the intellectual capacity of humans and tends to maximize the intellectual capacity of chimpanzees, all right? And the reason for that is what they want to do is they want to narrow that gap. They want to narrow the gap between chimpanzees and humans, okay? And so Jonathan Wells, I mentioned him earlier, his book earlier, he says, the public is rarely told that the fossils have been placed into pre-existing narrative structures. That's the artist rendering that I'm talking about, okay? Or that the story they are hearing rests on biases, preconceptions, and assumptions. And then, as a takeoff from Winston Churchill, he says, it seems that never in the field of science have so many based so much on so little. And so the overall fossil record is fragmented. the specimens themselves are fragmented, and that leads to the third problem with the whole science of fossils, is that the whole field of human paleontology is fragmented. Okay, and what I mean by that is that because the record is fragmented and because the specimens are fragmented, there's a lot of paleontologists, human paleontologists, who are out there just making things up and coming up with their own ideas. And what that leads to is just a great deal of debate and differences between paleontologists. Okay, and so these two writers here who write on this subject say human evolutionary studies have been plagued by debate and controversy. The reasons for argument over a fragment of a jaw, a partial skull, and a handful of teeth, or an uncertain geological error are not that difficult to understand. It's pretty easy to understand why there's so much disagreement when you realize how little they have to go on. And I love this quote from Mark Davis. He's a PBS Nova producer. And in producing a documentary, he interviewed a number of leading paleoanthropologists. And he said when he interviewed them, he said this, he said, each Neanderthal expert thought that the last one I talked to was an idiot, if not an actual Neanderthal. So there's this tremendous disagreement among paleoanthropologists on this whole area of human origins and on the fossil record. So when someone comes to you and tries to represent to you that the fossil record is just this nice, cohesive, complete picture of human evolution, you can graciously disabuse them of that illusion. Okay? Then there's this question about genetic similarity. Okay? And so, as I mentioned, the claim is there's only 1% difference between humans and chimpanzees. But this number arises from just a way that the nucleotide bases are counted in DNA. So you remember we had that picture of DNA up here a couple weeks ago, and you have those ladders in the DNA, the rungs of the ladder in the DNA, and each one is made up of 2 nucleotide bases. And so they're counting the nucleotide bases, and the actual difference, though, is much greater than that 1%. It's probably 5 to 6 times greater than that. Because there's just a whole lot of other factors involved than just the number, just a comparison, a raw comparison of the nucleotide bases. Again, this is a quote from Theistic Evolution. Our results imply that humans and chimpanzees differ by at least 6%, he gives the number there, in their complement of genes, which stands in stark contrast to the off-cited 1.5% difference between orthologous nucleotide sequences. So the number of differences in the DNA is actually quite a bit more than is oftentimes cited. But also you have to keep in mind that a very small difference in the DNA can have a very huge impact down the line. Okay, so just a small difference in the DNA can have a considerable amount of impact down the line. And one thing to keep in mind is that various genes in the DNA, what we call coding genes, these are the genes in the DNA that actually code for protein. They oftentimes, many coding genes can code for multiple proteins, for more than one protein, okay? So this allows for a great deal of variety even within a single gene as to what it's capable of doing. And in addition to that, when you think about the coding genes, the genes that code for proteins, what they're doing is they're directing the building of proteins. And if you think about chimpanzees and humans, obviously we're going to have a whole lot of the same proteins, right? So just because you have a lot of the same proteins, I probably have a lot of the same proteins as a dog, you know, or any other creature. So just the fact that the genes are similar doesn't mean that they're necessarily making the same kind of proteins, and if they are making the same kind of proteins, that doesn't mean they're going to be assembled in the same kind of a body plan, okay? And then you get to the non-coding portions of DNA. So you have the genes that code for proteins, but then you have vast amounts of DNA that do not code for proteins, okay? And much of that DNA now they recognize just operates as works as an operating system for the cell and for the organism. So when you think about it, an operating system directs kind of the overall processes. So you can have two computers. One computer is being used to engineer machinery, and another computer is being used to write poetry, but they're both using the same operating system because much of what they do is the same, even though they are two machines doing two radically different things, right? So it's the same with DNA. You have this operating system in your cells, okay, and it's directing things like how you breathe and how you metabolize food, and that can be similar across widely varying species, okay? So my means of metabolizing food or my means of breathing and processing oxygen may be very similar to a chimpanzee or a cat or whatever, but that doesn't make me a descendant of that particular creature, okay? And then there's this issue about, okay, even if it were true that there was only 1% difference, okay? So even if it is true that there's a great deal of similarity between us genetically, and even if it's true that there's some difference, some similarity in our structures, so don't press me here, but if you looked at me and you looked at a great ape, you might see some general comparison, some general similarity. But to argue that we come from a common descent commits a logical fallacy, okay? And we've talked about this back in our lessons on argumentation and logic. We talked about logical fallacies, in particular logical fallacy. And one we talked about, remember, was one called affirming the consequent, okay, is a logical fallacy. And this argument that similarity is evidence of common descent commits a logical fallacy. So just very briefly by way of review, the fallacy of affirming the consequent follows this form. If A, then B, B therefore A. And what did we decide was the problem with that argument? You remember? Dragging things out from ancient history here. I know we talked about this. Okay, well, we know that according to this, if A, then B, so let's just accept that as true. If A is true, then we get B. Okay? If A, then B. That may be true, okay? But it may also be true that if C, then B, right? So I could say to you, if I'm out of eggs, I'll go to the grocery store. So you see me at the grocery store and say, well, you must have been out of eggs. Well, maybe not. I might have also been out of bread, right? So if it's true, if A, if I'm out of eggs, B, I'll go to the grocery store. I cannot then say, well, I saw him at the grocery store, he had to have been out of eggs. That's a logical fallacy, right? Because there are other reasons why I might have gone to the grocery store, all right? So that is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And it turns out this is exactly what's happening in this line of argument. So the argument is, the claim is that similarity of form or similarity of our genes is evidence for common descent. So the argument goes like this. If common descent, then similarity. Similarity. We have similarity, therefore common descent. So you can see it's structured in the form of a logical fallacy. All right? There may be something else that produces similarity other than common descent. Now, we know that common descent produces similarity. Several years ago, I was at a conference here in Norman, and a guy walked up to me and he said to me, excuse me, do you have a brother in Lawrence, Kansas? And I said, yeah, I have a brother in Lawrence, Kansas. And then he gave me his name, and I said, yeah, that's my brother. He had no idea that my brother, he was from Lawrence, he had no idea that my brother had a brother. But he was at this conference in Norman, he saw me, and the similarity was so striking, he concluded we must have come from a common ancestor, which it happens we did. In fact, I have another brother who's also plagued with the same disadvantage of us being alike. But so clearly we do know that common descent breeds similarity, but we know there's something else that makes things similar too. So I have a friend here in Norman who's become actually a fairly popular artist here in Norman, and he does all kinds of paintings. He's a good friend of mine. We work together, not painting paintings, but doing other things. And as I go around town, I'm in various people's homes. If I come across a painting, I can look at it and I go, okay, that's one of Tim's paintings. Okay, well, how do I know that? Because he has a certain style he uses. He has a certain repetitive style that he uses over and over again. There's a building downtown that he's painted a mural on. All I have to do is just drive by that building and I see that mural on the wall and I go, oh yeah, that's Tim's painting because it's painted the way he paints. So we know that a common designer also produces similarity, right? So when someone says, well, we have similarity, that's evidence of common descent, my reply is, no, wait a minute, we have similarity that may be evidence of a common designer, not common descent. Okay? So don't let them sell you a bill of goods with that fallacy. Then we have the fifth problem is just the utter uniqueness of humans. So you get this, oftentimes there's tremendous emphasis put on some of the similarities that we've just been talking about. But the fact is, there's a huge gap between humans and chimpanzees. And I gave you a handout there in which Ann Gager talks about a number of those differences between humans and chimpanzees. And it is such a vast gap that it's just impossible to conceive of how all those differences could have been accomplished in the amount of time that the evolutionists allow for this process to have happened. I'm not going to go into that any more of that because you have a handout on it. So that brings up the next question, next problem is the problem of time. So there's just not a sufficient amount of time given the 2 to 6 million years that evolutionists say we have. Now that sounds like, to us, that sounds like a lot of time, okay? But when we're talking about the mathematical improbabilities of these various genetic mutations taking place and then those mutations getting fixed into a particular population, there's just not sufficient time. So again, Gager and Hofstra and Reeves in Theistic Evolution write this. They say, here's the problem. To get a single mutation in a DA binding site, so you're just going to get one change in one nucleotide binding site, okay? And have it become fixed in the population would take anywhere from 1.5 million years to 6 million years, depending on whose calculations you use. So she's using the calculations that evolutionists use to figure out how long these things take, okay? If 2 mutations are needed to get a change in behavior or anatomy, it would take approximately between 84 and 216 million years. Once again, depending on whose calculations are used. Yet we have only 6 million years since we supposedly diverged from chimpanzees. If even one essential trait required 2 specific coordinated mutations, the evolutionary process would stall completely because 216 million years is too long to wait. The neo-Darwinian process cannot accomplish what it is needed to explain our origin in the time available. So just to kind of restate it, what she's saying is, okay, if you just need one mutation, that's going to take you anywhere from 1.5 million years to 6 million years. But if you had to have two mutations in the DNA in order to accomplish just the slightest change, a slight change in the posture of the ape to get it stand upright like humans, or any number of them. Some of them she lists there in her discussion there in your handout. If you have to have two mutations to accomplish it, then it just blows the time allowed, just the time needed, completely out of any reasonable possibility of there being enough time. So there just simply is not enough time for all the changes to take place between chimpanzees and humans. And then the other problem just comes to just kind of the whole idea of reconstructing this whole idea of human origins. So given the fragmentary nature of the fossil record that we talked about, the absence of data, that sort of thing, then clearly the reconstruction of this whole process of how we got from point A to point B, that's largely just estimates and speculation, because all they have are just a few fragments to work with if we're talking about the fossils. Secondly, that whole idea then that also that the diversity we have within the human DNA is evidence of multiple ancestors rather than a single pair, doesn't take into consideration the possibility that the initial pair had diversity in their DNA to start with. Okay? And if they had that diversity in their genes to start with, then that would account for that. So there's another possible explanation for that diversity. And again, let me just come back, because I think this point is important. And actually, I had the opportunity to have a Zoom conference with Ann Gager here 2 or 3 years ago. I had some questions that I wanted to ask her, and I sent her an email, and she very graciously said, well, let's Zoom about it. So actually, I drug Ryan and Ronnie in, and we Zoomed together with Ann, and we talked about this. And I said, so now what you're saying is that the evolutionists are saying that we didn't evolve from a single pair. We evolved from a number of different proto-humans or a number of different chimpanzees. And she says, yes, that's what they are saying. And I said, so actually doesn't that open the door for racism? Doesn't that open the door wide open to say, well, these humans evolved differently than these humans evolved, and so there's maybe some reason why I could argue? And she says, absolutely, that's where it leads. I think that's just a profound implication of the naturalist narrative that I think we need to point out to them. So we then have two competing hypotheses. We have the hypothesis of common descent involving a population of several thousand, or we have the biblical narrative. So that's what we are given as our options today. We can accept and believe the biblical record, the Christian teaching on the origin of humans, or we can embrace this very problematic view of the origin of humans, which, contrary to popular belief, just doesn't have the scientific support that it claims to have. Okay? Incidentally, in talking with Ann, she and Doug Axe and a number of other people are engaged in an actual research project, and they're trying to, through a scientific research, they're trying to establish this possibility of created diversity in the original pair. So it was interesting to talk to her about that, and she said, I asked her how that was going, and she said they were very encouraged by the progress they're making, but it is a long-term project, so it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So. Then briefly, again, I just want to come back and talk about, just leaving the whole subject of origins now, I want to talk about the subject of intelligent design and just kind of remind us of some things about intelligent design so we understand where it stands in relationship to us as Christians, okay? So, first I want to make a distinction between intelligent design and the design argument. So intelligent design is a scientific endeavor. Okay? Intelligent design is a scientific argument for design from the scientific data. Okay? That's what it is. It doesn't make any claims or any assertions regarding the nature of that designer, of the identity of that designer. It's just arguing for intelligent design, or an intelligent designer, or an intelligent design seen in nature. That's different from the design argument. So when we talked about arguments for the existence of God, we talked about the teleological argument. And so as a Christian, when I'm talking to somebody and I'm wanting to win them to Christ or win them to the Christian faith or whatever, I'll use the design argument, which is the argument that David uses in the Psalms and Paul uses in Romans. The heavens are declaring the glory of God. And so I'll point to nature and I'll say, this reveals to you the God of Scripture. Okay? That's the design argument. That's different than intelligent design. Intelligent design is not making philosophical or theological claims. It's making scientific claims. It's saying the science that we have, given what we know, points to an intelligent designer. The design argument says, I want to tell you who that designer is, and these are evidences that he exists, and this is evidence of the way he is. So those are really two different things. And in intelligent design, the design hypothesis is simply that the best inference from the existence of information and other features of the natural world is an intelligent source. So Stephen Meyer, who's of course one of the leading minds in the intelligent design movement, says the theory of intelligent design, brief definition, is that the idea is that there are certain features of living systems in the universe that is best explained by a designing intelligence as opposed to a purely materialistic, undirected process. And so you get, of course, many scientists, most scientists, who are vigorously opposed to intelligent design. But the reason they're opposed to intelligent design is not because of the science of intelligent design, usually, but it's because of the metaphysical implications. It's because they clearly see that if there's intelligent design, there must be some kind of an intelligent designer, and that's what they don't want. So they're making a metaphysical objection or a philosophical objection to intelligent design, not a scientific one. But what's happening there is it's their own metaphysical assumption. It's their own philosophical or theological assumption that's dictating that response to intelligent design. So they're objecting to intelligent design on philosophical grounds, that intelligent design has philosophical implications they don't like. But in doing so, they themselves are taking a scientific position based on their own metaphysical presupposition, and that is metaphysical naturalism. All right? So if you think about it, if we want science to proceed freely, and we want it to, if we want science to go where the evidence leads, then the way to do that is to lift that metaphysical naturalism restriction off of science. If we take that restriction off of science, that science can only think about metaphysical naturalism, if we take that restriction off, then science is free to lead us wherever the facts are, without a superimposition of somebody's metaphysical presuppositions. Well, we've talked about how to recognize design before. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I want to point out the philosopher Alvin Plantinga. We've talked about him many times. He argues that the ability to recognize design is hardwired into us. Okay? You just walk down the street and you see things that you just think occurred naturally, and you see other things and you say that was designed. Okay? And Plantinga argues that that's hardwired into our cognitive processes. That's just when our cognitive processes are working properly, what he calls properly functioning. When they're properly functioning, we just detect design automatically. Okay, and Doug Axe has done some work on this too, and he's written a very good book, very readable book, the book Undeniable, in which he argues also for what he calls the universal design intuition. Okay, so he says it's virtually universal that all human beings, starting from infancy, have an intuition of design. We just know when something is designed. We can just intuit it. Now, he doesn't argue that it's infallible. He says it can make mistakes. We can think something's designed when it isn't, or we can think something isn't designed when it is. Okay, so he doesn't argue that it's infallible, but he does argue that it is there. And so what intelligent design does then is it gives some precision to this intuition that we have. So we have this intuition of design, and what intelligent design does is it gives precision to us. It helps us to know and detect design more precisely. Okay? So these other things we've already talked about before. So just very quickly then, just keep in mind that intelligent design is only a scientific endeavor, okay? It doesn't define all the characteristics of the intelligence that it detects. It doesn't say which, if any, theistic belief is correct, okay? And these first 2 points are really made more obvious by the fact that there are a number of non-Christians now who are beginning to accept this whole idea of some kind of intelligent design, even though they are not Christians. So for us as Christians, though, as we're doing Christian apologetics, of course, what we want to do is we want to present the God that's revealed in the Bible, and where intelligent design comes in is it comes in as a tool that we can use in doing that. So we don't believe in God because of scientific intelligent design theory, but scientific intelligent design theory helps to buttress and support our belief in God and strengthen our appeal to others when we share our faith with them. Okay? So next week we're going to talk about the subject of miracles and science. So has scientific discovery precluded the possibility of miracles? So we're going to look at miracles from a philosophical and a scientific perspective and try to answer that question next week. So that's it. Any questions?